So without further ado, let me introduce my colleague, Paul Morrison. Paul's a JPIT policy advisor covering issues around poverty and inequality and the economy. And Paul is going to talk us through some of the background to the current crisis. Over to you, Paul.
Hi, and thank you for turning out to listen and take part in this webinar. If I look slightly to this side, it's because my dog's just looked around the corner into my room. And the last time she did that, she brought in a squirrel. And I'm hoping she's not going to do that tonight. I think to start off with, I think it's probably important just to say some really basic numbers. So the cost of living is increasing, and I think we've all seen that in the news. We started to see that before the fuel price rises. So the fuel price rise was last month, but before that, prices had started going up, and church leaders and people and other community leaders like yourselves had started to contact us and had started to get a little bit worried because especially food prices had started to go up just after Christmas. But the big increase and the enormous increase that is in fuel prices. So in the inflation report that was published 2 weeks ago, the headline rate's 9%, but that's made up of a 95% increase in gas prices and a 53% increase in electricity prices. And then the thing that actually started us worrying about the cost of living was the increase in food prices, which is getting to about 7%. The headline rate doesn't work for everyone because inflation is about a basket of goods. And it's the basket of goods the average person buys, but we aren't any of us average people. And the poorest buy more of certain goods than the richest, and they buy more fuel as a proportion of their income, and they buy more food as a proportion of their income. So their inflation rate is near 11%, and it's probably considerably higher because if you were buying the cheapest thing in the supermarket, it has been going up faster than the average thing in the supermarket. So the cheapest food prices have been going up faster than the average food prices. So that means that if you were struggling on a low budget, your inflation rate is 11, 12, 13, 14. Our best guess at the moment is about 15%, but at the end of the month, we'll get a number from the Office of National Statistics on that. And that is it is unprecedented in the last 30 years. We have not come close to that level of inflation in the last 30 years. And I think it's difficult for lots of people and lots of people struggling through this to get their head around what that's going to mean for their budget as the year progresses. And just to cheer you up further, today the Ofgem, the regulator, has given a prediction for what the increase in the energy price cap is going to be over when it comes up for renewal in September. And that's going to be a further £800. So that is going to be more than the last increase. So it will take us to well over £2,000. It will take us to about £2,800 per family, per average house. And I think the most, you've all been sent out the briefing, I think, and you may or may not want to wade through it, that's grand. But I think the most important story in it is something that came out just on Thursday. There is a system called Fuel Direct, which is essentially direct debit for people receiving benefits. It's run by the DWP, and energy bills go direct to the energy company if you use this Fuel Direct payment system. The DWP has just stopped that system because or stopped new entrants into that system because the energy companies were putting an average price hike to somebody on universal credit of £110 a month. So this is people whose income, the basic allowance, is about £350. And the price hike is £110. And that will increase by the same amount or more come September. And the Department of Work and Pensions has said, well, that prevents people from making budgeting choices, which is a strange euphemism, because your budgeting choice with £110 extra bill on those sorts of incomes is debt or meeting your basic needs. There isn't any other budgeting choice available. So I can, you know, in questions later on, we can go into the details of the different types of prices that have gone up and what the likely effects will be. But the summary that's at the start of the briefing, which comes from Action for Children, who've put out a campaign, and its first line is, our frontline staff have told us that child poverty levels are the worst they can remember. It's going to take a long time for these price rises to show up in national statistics and national figures. So if you're looking for it to show up in the poverty figures, that will happen in April next year. So we'll be in this bit of ambiguity while there'll be ambiguity sort of in the statistics for the next few months. But what we know from the Food Foundation is that food insecurity has gone up. It is 2.5 times larger in people who have a disability. So when we've talked to people who are having to pay these huge price rises, essentially their only coping strategy has been, I'm not going to use fuel. I was at a food bank today, and they were telling me that the average food parcel they give out now is the not cooked one for new clients. So that the thing that people are going to do is just not use fuel. And that might work for the summer, but when we hit the winter, that will be rather different. That will be much more difficult. But also, if you have a disability, the option not to use fuel may not be available or may be much more costly for you in terms of your long-term health. And we can go. There are much more details that we can go through, but I don't think we should. I just want to tell you one of the other things that I think is really important, that has come from community leaders and that has come actually less so from the people who experience poverty themselves, which is this is not a crisis in isolation. That the communities that are feeling the cost of living the hardest have been through 10 years of austerity and then had the rough end of a pandemic. That the people in those places and the support systems in those places are under-resourced. We're now beginning to get data in to show that one of the effects of the cost of living crisis is that donations to smaller charities are going down now. So they are under-resourced and they're tired. But there is another story of the last 10 years, and one that it's really important to hear, one that it's extraordinarily important to hear, which is that over the last 10 years, the average income in the United Kingdom increased. Not as quickly as it did in the 10 years previously, but it increased. In real terms, the average British person got richer. The average wealth in the United Kingdom increased. The average British person got wealthier. The amount of food bought increased. And the number of rooms per house or per person increased. So we became a wealthier country. And we started the decade at 13.1 million in poverty, and we ended it at 14.6 million in poverty. We started the decade with very little in the way of destitution. We don't have a combined number for destitution in 2010. By 2015, it is 1.5 million. By 2019, it was 2.5 million. Trussell Trust was serving around about 30,000 people in 2010. By 2019, it was 2.5 million. Those two stories coexist, one in which we get gradually wealthier together, and one in which poverty increases, and one in which food bank use increases. So one of the things that is really important to hold is that it is not that there are not the resources there. It is not that there is not the money there. It is that it is poorly distributed. And the same can be said about the cost of living crisis that is hitting us now. If you look at PricewaterhouseCoopers' projection about the effects of inflation over the next year, they estimate, and I'll actually have to look at my notes for this bit because I haven't memorized those numbers yet. PricewaterhouseCoopers estimates that the poorest fifth of households are going to lose about £1,500. Their spending power will be about £1,500 less. It's going to be in the upper range. It also estimates that the top fifth of households, their disposable income is likely to stay the same. And that's because as lots of money, it isn't that there is less money, it is that it's being sucked down different channels and given to different people. Oil hasn't got more expensive to get out of the ground or refine or produce or put into our cars. All of those prices are the same. What has happened is that if you hold a futures contract, it's become more valuable because people are worried that there might be short supply. And the same is true with foods, and the same is true with all sorts of other products that are going up. That for this, at this point anyway, and we can't predict much beyond September, the costs of making the products that are going up are going to stay the same. But what's happening is the prices that people pay, and that money is going to other places. And the last thing I want to talk about is policy. And the role of government is to make a good society out of these changing flows of money and resources. And one of the key things that government can do, it cannot protect everyone from inflation, but it can decide which people are exposed and which people aren't. And I think it won't surprise you to know that I was apoplectic when the spring statement came. I was not a happy man because the spring statement spent 18 billion, which is a lot of money. The £20 a week uplift in universal credit cost less than 5 billion. Probably would have cost about 5.5 billion if you'd included the other benefits as well. So you could increase benefits by £60 a week for everyone with 18 billion pounds. But instead it was spent on tax cuts, which by and large, the majority are rebates and various other things, which by and large benefited the upper end of earners or people in the top half of earners rather than the bottom half. So £2 out of every 3 went to households that were earning above the average amount. And that has real consequences. So going forward, the government is going to have to do something. It is quite clear the government has got to have a new package. As a national church, and there are all sorts of other organizations, and there's some links in the briefing as to other people who want to join in this. They are just calling for benefits to be uprated in line with the inflation rate that people are actually experiencing now, which is a really basic and simple task. But in the longer term, we have to find a way of designing a benefit system such that it meets basic needs, such that meeting basic needs is baked into its design. And part of the thing that churches can do now and into the future is finding ways of saying that those people who experience poverty are A, not being served well by the current system, but B, are worth being treated properly, that they are valuable, that they are created in God's image, and that they have gifts and things that they have gifts that they wish that can be given to society. And the last thing I will end it is that there's lots that can be done at a local level. Sometimes the national level of politics looks quite bleak. But there's huge amounts that your local representatives can do relatively cheaply to make the lives of people in low incomes a lot better. So there's things called a council tax reduction scheme. For some, in some places, that just doesn't exist for people on low incomes. They pay 100% of council tax out of the universal credit. In some places, they pay nothing of council tax out of the universal credit because they're completely protected. That's up to your local authority. And you can talk to your local authority about the choice they make. The government gives money for what's called local welfare assistance schemes, but 2/3 of that money gets diverted because it's not ring fenced. So the council gets it and 2/3 goes other places. In some places, it's all spent on families with low income. And in some places, none of it is spent on families with low income. Again, your local authority can change these things. So there are things that can be done with the representatives you talk to day in and day out that can make real differences in the next few weeks, the next few months, and the next few years. But I'm going to shut up because I've probably taken Eunice's time as I so often do. I apologize. But the heart of Church at the Margins, which Eunice is about, which Eunice works with, is that God is already at work. God is already present in people who experience poverty. And if we get that across, then that is what long-term change is made out of. And I'm going to hand over to Eunice.
Oh, thank you so much as ever for that. And I think it's really important to hear that briefing and hear the reality of what people experiencing poverty are actually dealing with and some of the issues that have led to that. I want to share now a bit about the vision for Church at the Economic Margins amongst people experiencing poverty and to ask you some questions. I think we have to ask, as Paul has already hinted at, that question of why should Christians care about people experiencing poverty? And I feel like you all might be sitting on this call thinking, not only is that obvious, but yes, of course, Eunice, yes, of course we should. But I also think we need to ask an honest question. If we quickly come to the conclusion that we should care about Christians, care about people experiencing poverty, why doesn't the Christian Church? Because the Christian Church has largely distanced itself from people in low-income communities and people who are struggling. But let's just think about that why, that really important why Christians should care about people experiencing poverty. It goes back to the text of Genesis 1 for me, that every human being is created in the image of God. Every human being has intrinsic worth, dignity, and value. And that to me has to be the fundamental starting point. And therefore, poverty, we know, robs people of dignity. It robs people of feeling valued. It robs people of that intrinsic worth. It creates people who experience physical, emotional, and psychological ill health. We know that that happens. And therefore, It denies something of what it is to be human. I think it's Rowan Williams has a quote that I like. He says that God did not make us human to become Christians. He made us Christian to become more human. And to be human is at the heart of this. When you look at the biblical narrative, particularly at the Hebrew Bible, you see the prophets raging against the injustices of the day. They raged against the multiple impoverishment of people in different ways, and they challenged the structures of their day. At the beginning of Jesus' ministry, we see an echo of the Isaiah text, and one of my favourite passages is Luke 4. You'll know it really well, and I just want to remind you of it tonight. It's that famous passage when Jesus stood up, was given the scroll of the prophet Isaiah. Unrolling it, he found the place where it is written, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to preach good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recovery of sight for the blind, to release the oppressed, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favour." Do you notice in that text some real contrasting things, some movements? Jesus moved from the wilderness to his hometown of Nazareth. If you were to carry on read the text, you see that Jesus went from being this honoured guest, being invited to read the scroll. At the end of it, it doesn't go well for Jesus, because after he said his speech, they drive him off. They want to murder him. They drive him out of the town. But when Jesus speaks, he edits 2 quotes from the prophet Isaiah, and he removes the day of vengeance. Jesus' ministry begins with kindness and advocating justice. And if you were to go on and read Luke 4, Jesus doesn't send to the great patriarchs. He chooses 2 Gentile heroes of faith, a widowed woman and a man with leprosy, 2 people with lived experience of poverty, and he places them right at the centre. So at the beginning of Jesus' ministry, he proclaims justice, compassion, freedom to those held captive, and he invites the people in front of him to think about a more expansive imagination of God. Even in that text, Jesus prioritizes the lived experience of people. And that must be at the heart of all we do, that we must centre the lived experience of people experiencing poverty. We as a church need to work out how to amplify their voices. So the church at the margins, church at the economic margins, is about being alongside people. It's about co-design, co-delivering, co-creating alongside the fabulous people that are those people who live and are struggling. These are some of the strongest people you'll ever come across. The idea that they are deficient and that they all have these needs that other people can meet is a nonsense. They're some of the strongest people you will ever meet. We want to think about the way in which, therefore, Jesus deeply intertwines social justice and evangelism. Good news and justice go together. So the answer to why is that the biblical story, the arc of the biblical story, talks about justice and demonstrates that poverty contradicts the will of God. So what might this mean for us in our churches? I think it's got to impact on our preaching. You cannot preach in a crisis, in the cost of living crisis, and not therefore think, what does this mean for how we reflect on the biblical passage? And I want to challenge us to think about what passages do we choose to preach from. Sometimes what we preach about and what we sing about kinds of anaesthetizes us to the realities of what's going on around us. For worship to be real, it needs to speak into the reality of the experiences. I think we need to think about the reality that people in our church communities may well struggle and be people who are experiencing poverty. We mustn't act like there's an us and them. And whilst I acknowledge that I have used that language because I acknowledge my white middle class privilege, we must be careful not to assume that no one in the church community is actually struggling. And one of my questions is, how do we create and enable safe enough spaces for people to tell the truth about their financial circumstances? Poverty is often deeply shaming, and therefore people keep it hidden. My own personal story is when I was very young, my family grew up in poverty. And I remember my dad saying to me when I was little, if anyone asks, are we struggling? The answer is no, we're fine. We're all fine. He was too proud to admit there was a problem. And I wonder if we perpetuate that in our churches. I wonder how easy would it be in the church that you belong to for someone to tell you the truth about their financial circumstances. That's sometimes really, really difficult. And what can we do as Christians? One of the things I think we really have to do is listen. Listen, listen, listen. Listen to people who are struggling. Go and find out for ourselves. That might be joining in with local agencies, local organisations. We need to join, I would suggest joining in rather than doing things. We mustn't do things to people. We must join in with what's already going on. One of the crucial things for me is being normal, making friends, actually developing friendships in communities together where we really do know each other. So I'm part of a new church, a new Christian community, and we have a real diverse group of people, and we spend lots of time getting to know each other. And we know each other, so we tell each other the truth about what is going on in our lives. We tell each other and we become friends together. So we want to resist the idea that we're meeting the needs of other people. That feels very one-sided, doesn't it? In which we have all the power and other people are the recipients of our goodwill. I think people want friendship, people want community, and that's the way in which people will be able to say precisely what they need. So I want to challenge you to think about, how do you enable the voices of people experiencing economic poverty to be heard in your community, in your family, in your churches? What might it mean for you to prioritise the lived experience of people at the economic margins? If we really believe they are partners and we're not going to, you see, we don't want things that do things to people. You remember that Poverty Truth Commission slogan that actually was from a disability campaign, nothing about us without us is for us. That's really, really true. The really important word is with, alongside and with people. And so we will have to learn how to share power. We might actually have to learn how to give things away, how to give up our power, how to give up our resources. If I were to ask you the question, is there enough food in the world to feed everyone? You know the answer is yes. Is there enough clean water for everyone? Yes. Do we enable everyone to access those things? No, we don't. And sometimes it's easy, isn't it, as Christians to think about, well, what should other people do? But in this webinar tonight, Paul and I want to challenge you. What is mine to do? What is yours to do? It might not be the same thing. I'm very clear that Paul's responsibility is to look at all those numbers and do all those clever things that he does and reads all those papers and to surface for us some of the realities of what's going on. For me, it's to encourage you as Christians to actually ask, what difference will this make in my life? We're living in unprecedented times, a time that's described to me as a permanent crisis, turbulent times in which we know many more people are going to experience poverty to the point of experiencing destitution. We know that's not right. We know that Jesus said to abandon the poor was to abandon the gospel. We have an opportunity to be Christians. And Morrison talks a lot about social justice being an opportunity for Christians to act like Christians. One of my favourite straplines for all Christians is, be less weird, make more friends, be kind. Jesus, at the beginning of his ministry, invited us to step into the imagination of God. Something about this idea of kindness, not vengeance, but actually being with and amongst people. So this is definitely about celebrating inclusion and participation, resisting that service provider model of community engagement, resisting needs meeting that says you are deficient, you are lacking, because that's not true. Because every human being is made in the image of God, created with intrinsic dignity, worth, and value. So this for me is about possibly us giving things away. Wouldn't that be wonderful? I also want to challenge us to think about finances. In many churches, they're doing great work, creating food banks. And food banks are great, aren't they? But I know, and Paul will echo this, everyone wants to get rid of food banks because there is no dignity in that. Food pantries are better, but ultimately people deserve to have enough money to make their own food choices. But what would it really look like if God's church really put their money alongside the theological aspiration and the belief that poverty contradicts the will of God? What if our finances in our churches actually reflected that? What if our personal giving reflected that? It seems to me that we have something to be challenged by. The word of God always challenges me. Whenever I hear it, I always have to ask, not what would other people do, but what is mine to do? So friends, I want to invite you to think tonight, what is God's invitation to you? In this cost of living crisis, what is yours to do? It may be that yours is to campaign. It may be that yours is to preach. It may be that yours is to challenge other people to think about what it is to be a community. It may be to enable that safer space in your church and community, to enable people to really tell the truth about their circumstances. I feel very compelled that all of us have something to do. We cannot talk about being in a crisis and do nothing. Always we have to ask before God, what is mine to do? Thank you so much for listening to me, and I look forward to your questions later on.
Thank you so much, Eunice, for those words of challenge and also of encouragement. You're really good at holding those two things together. Welcome back from your breakout rooms. I hope that was a welcome change of pace and of focus. I hope also you had some conversations that have prompted some questions or some ideas that we might want to talk about. I know there are some questions people have already started putting into the chat. That's one way you can put a question forward. And so we'll pick up a couple of those to start with. And then if people want to kind of speak a question, if you could use the raise hand function, that would help me spot you because there's quite a lot of people here today. But Paul and Eunice, if we could join me on the screen, and I notice Jackie McLeod has asked a question, Paul, about you were talking about the role of local authorities, and what things could we be doing? Could we be asking our local authorities to do in particular, Paul?
The question about how you go about it. And the really simple answer is everyone had, well, the first thing to do is to find out what your local authority does. Find out, because I remember the first time I was in a meeting like this and told people about council tax reduction schemes, I realized I had no idea what Wandsworth Council, which is where I live, council tax reduction scheme was like. And I'm thinking, I am the sort of nerd who enjoys these facts and I don't know who is going to. So the first thing to do is find out, and that'll be in the website. And the second thing to do is contact your councillor. And you would be pleasantly surprised. Most councillors in most places will welcome those sorts of conversations, especially from a church. They will welcome those sorts of conversations in which they can meet people in their ward and talk to people with different experiences in the ward. Rarely is that not the case, and because Simeon is my team leader, and I need to impress him. One of the other things you can do is we're having a conference which is all about how you do these things, how you make change from the ground up, and I believe we may have 1 or 2 tickets left. I mean, you'll have to come quick, but I'm sure we might fit you in if you went onto our website and tried to book into that. Do I get my bonus this year, Simeon?
We'll think about it. Thank you, Paul. I think it's important the point you make about the way that local authorities have quite a lot of discretion over how they administer these different funds and relief packages. So it is really worth asking them, because it may be that there isn't very much scrutiny of that at the moment. And as you're conscious of needs increasing in your communities, it's a good way of drawing attention to that. Through your local councillor to start with, but also through council officials potentially. Great, there are lots of other questions kind of coming up in the chat and comments as well. Ruth Box asks what could be doing to challenge our local MPs. I don't know if either of you want to pick up on that.
I think writing to them, going to them. I think as well, thinking about how do you galvanise lots of people to do a little bit of a campaign, to generate, doing it together rather than just on your own, to really animate your church community, the church council, synod. I think being agitators is crucial. Keep it on the agenda so that people are alert to the issues and easy opportunities. So I see all over the place, you know, standard templates on particular things for MPs that many of I know many Methodist activists put much of their stuff of what they're doing on the internet, freely available. And I think taking opportunities like that is a good idea.
If I could also say, I was at I can't remember. I wasn't there, I was sitting here, but I was zooming into a meeting in somewhere, I think it was Nottingham. But they had arranged meetings with the people who helped out in their food bank, and some of the food bank, especially some of the volunteers who had previously been helped by the food bank. And they had a meeting with their local MP in a round table. So bringing your MP next to people who have either experienced that or at least have lived the experience of poverty in some way or watched the experience of poverty closely. Those sort of encounters are what genuinely change people's mind. And I heard good reports about how that encounter went, even though the local MP was probably not viewed as highly sympathetic, he was able to go and meet and have other points put to him.
Thank you. Eunice, there's a question here for you from the Millards. They say, I agree that working with rather than for is better, and we should avoid doing things for people when they can do it themselves with appropriate resources and help. So where do holiday hunger schemes and having lunches through the summer fit into that? Would you prefer a model where families cook together and then eat together in a church kitchen?
I really appreciate that schemes that respond to immediate need. I'm not saying that we stop doing those, but we think as much as possible about how can people actually be involved. So it might be, yes, a model of cooking, families cooking together, or at the very least, do we know that the things that we're providing are the things that people want to eat? You know, every day we choose what we want to eat. I eat terrible. I'm at Cliff College. I've just eaten a massive plate of carbohydrate, but I've chosen that from a range of options. Other people giving you what they think you might want. So there is more dignity in choice of food and involving people in actually how do they want it to run? What could it look like? How could it be done in collaboration with people? But well done to everyone who responds to holiday hunger and who provides lunches. But what would it be like to be more dignified and actually have choice in that?
Thank you. I noticed in the chat people are also recommending things that they've been involved in or that they've seen happen locally. Jeff Hawkins recommending the CAP life skills course is a good thing to run and to offer as a church at the moment. Tracy Humes talking about how Gateshead Council have approached local churches about providing warm spaces. Obviously, where people can't afford their heating bills, that's going to be increasingly important in the autumn. I'll be brave enough, she asks, to say yes and to take some risks with that. And she also talks about the councils having access to the household support fund, which they have some discretion over how they use, and we could be asking them how they're using it to support local people through the crisis, and maybe helping them to find routes to identify people who would need that. So that's a really useful idea. There's also a kind of a challenge for I wonder if Eunice, you might want to come in this about how we run things as churches, kind of connectionally or nationally as churches, to ensure that our funding is going to the places where there's greatest need. Would you like to talk a bit about how your program connects with that desire, Eunice?
Oh yes, now that in the Methodist Church, Methodists on this call, this is one of my favourite topics. I would like all of you to agitate at church council, at synods, at every opportunity you can get to ask, what does it mean for us to be a church that says we have and vote for at conference, church at the economic margins? Where is the money? And how are we going to prioritise this as something that is really important and at the heart of our mission? So I think as a Methodist, this is about agitating. At district level and at circuit level, we make choices in every meeting. We all make a priority of what's important to us. What would it look like for local churches and for districts to really prioritise this and actually put our money where our theological aspiration is? That's what would transform us. I do think that Jesus would have, so if Jesus returned and looked at our finances, what would he think were our priorities? I want to be challenged by that, and I want to challenge the church. And I assure you, as Church at the Margins officer in the Methodist Church, I'm agitating at every point I can.
Great. And
sorry, I can vouch to and attest to that.
And I should say the other denominations, that's also a really useful challenge. I think the way that each denomination organises itself and its finances is different, but the question that we should be posing is the same one.
Can I also build on that and also ask whether or not the places where decision making is made is accessible to people who don't have money? Is it accessible to... There's very basic stuff about whether you need a car to drive to the meetings. There's very basic stuff just that starts there and goes all the way to what are the sort of people we like to see in our meetings, and we select to go to the more powerful meetings. And there's a lot of reflection about that, because actually most of the meetings I go to, people are quite like me in that they are white, middle class, educated. And maybe that is part of the reason why we tend to focus our money on areas that are white, middle class, and educated.
Thank you. Paul, I wonder if I could ask you a question, because people will be aware that that JPIT ran a campaign around debt issues during the pandemic, the Reset the Debt campaign. And how is debt affecting how people are experiencing the cost of living crisis?
In terms of the data, we don't have a great deal at the moment. From what we can see from surveys, we know that people in the bottom fifth of earnings have taken on about 20 to 25 billion extra in debt, which is quite a lot. But at the same time, overall, people in the United Kingdom have paid off around about 20 billion in debt and have put down about 250 billion extra in savings, because people who could stay at home didn't have the chance to go out and spend their money, and so they saved. But if your budget was in a knife edge, you had no choice but to borrow. So again, I was at a meeting today with Christians Against Poverty, and they're just collating their numbers for their report, which will be published next month. And what we're getting from them is that people didn't turn up for debt advice during the pandemic because people weren't being chased, that creditors weren't sending the letters, and people didn't feel under threat of debt. But the uptick has well and truly started, and it is coming apace. I think Step Change are saying a fairly similar story. So again, it's not a crisis. It's not a crisis in isolation. That debt was brought into the cost of living crisis. and people are going to have to cope with both increased prices and increased debt repayments as they try to sort of rebuild after the pandemic.
Thank you for that update. Okay, we are coming towards the end of our time together. We are going to keep this to an hour, because that's as much Zoom as anyone should manage on a Tuesday evening. If people have any kind of comments about the things that they might be going to do in response to this, it would be great to see them in the chat. And any other feedback, again, would be really welcome in the chat. We'll be looking at us afterwards. But I'm going to draw our conversation to a close now by mentioning just a couple of things. One is the cost of living crisis briefing from JPIT, which we put a link to in the chat earlier. That's a really useful source of some of the facts and figures that Paul kind of galloped through earlier and others. And it's just very helpful background to understanding and putting in context what people are facing at the moment. So do go and check that out and share that with others. Also, we are going to be putting the presentations that you heard this evening online in the next couple of days on that same web link, so that if you think there are others who would benefit from hearing this, then share that link with them. As Paul's got a brownie point already for mentioning, as JPIT, we have an event coming up on the 11th of June, our big national conference, which is an opportunity to explore this issue and other social justice issues further. And it's happening in London, but also online. And our speakers include Emma Revie, who's the Chief Executive of the Trussell Trust, who is the largest food bank provider in the UK, but has taken this very bold decision that their objective, their strategy, is to get rid of food banks. So she'll be a really interesting speaker, and there are many others as well. So tickets are available for that from the jointpublicissues.org.uk website. Do check that out if you haven't already. I'd like to end by thanking Eunice and Paul for their input and for illuminating and helping us focus on these really important issues. And I want to also thank all of you for taking time out this evening to be here, and for all that you're each doing and will continue to do in your churches and communities as you seek out to live out that calling to be good news for the poor in this crisis. May God bless you in your endeavours, and may you be encouraged in them as well. I'm just going to share a prayer of blessing as we wrap up now. As we seek to walk the way of Jesus amidst the challenges and crises of these days, let us go in peace and grace, knowing that the God of community is with us. May the Creator open up new possibilities before us. May we ever discover the face of Christ in our neighbours, and may the Spirit strengthen us to build God's kingdom. Amen. Thank you again, and good night, everyone.